Good afternoon. As Emil said, my name is Victor Foresti Castro, and I'm going to be talking about the potential of video games in art and education. I'm going to kick this off with a personal anecdote as to why this matters to me. As a child, and as abnormal as this might sound, video games were a great part of my family life. It wasn't something I did alone, but something I did with my family. I remember playing the original Call of Duties with my father, and I remember having my mother sometimes steal away my iPad so she could play Angry Birds all throughout the night. Whilst I played these Call of Duties with my father, I began to be very interested in their historical context. The defense of Stalingrad mattered to me because I had lived it in a video game. The Siege of Berlin mattered to me because I had lived it in a video game. But what really ignited the historical consciousness in me, and what still inspires me in the classroom to this day, is how later, when I was playing Operation Flashpoint with my grandfather, I noticed that one faction, namely the Red Army, was using a different gear. And I thought, wait, this seems to be newer, more advanced gear. I asked my grandfather, what was it about? He told me that what had basically happened was the Cold War. I said, a Cold War? He explained me, as you would to an 11-year-old, basically the Soviets marched upon Berlin, the West felt threatened, they both hid, pointed guns at each other for a few decades, and that was it. But as silly as that might seem, it made me realize that even though those two games were separated by developer, they were different series, they were still bound by one common fabric, and that is history. And upon revisiting these games recently, I realized if games were such an essential part in molding the learner that I am, why aren't games a bigger part of our school environment and of our discussion in art? In order to answer that, I'd like to ask another question. Why do we read George Orwell? Why do we read Chinua Achebe, for that matter? Well, it is because we consider their craft, literature, to be an art. But do we really consider video games to be an art? Well, I think that we need to turn to the German legal system to talk about this. On the left, on your left, my right, we can see an image from the video game Wolfenstein: The New Order, in which the Third Reich occupies the United States in an alternate history. As you can see, all the Nazi symbolism is removed from the game and is instead replaced by the game's logo. On the right, on your right, you can see a screen capture from the movie Das Boot, a German-produced and German-published movie that talks about the story of a U-boat crew during the Second World War. You can see that in the case of the movie, they could use all the Nazi symbolism to convey their message. But why are games impaired from doing so in Germany? Well, because the German legal system does not consider video games to be art. And to a great extent, our cultural perception of video games very much mirrors this. But this is sadly not without reason. There are obviously a few limitations that bar video games from being perceived as art. But I'd argue that these limitations are only social and in the way that we deal with video games and not inherent to the medium itself. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the demographic. Even though more than half of today's gamers are females, video games are still marketed, produced, and sold to men. This is because the men who grew up in the 80s and the 90s, these are the teenagers of that time, are still what the industry sees as the main consumers. It's also a problem that a small, however loud and obnoxious minority of those men have created a toxic community which shuns out women's voices in video games. They bully female game developers, harass female game journalists such as Anita Sarkeesian in the picture, because they do not want their perspective into video games, claiming it to be social justice and a barrier in the way of entertainment. This is obviously a limitation because if art doesn't have universal value, then what good is it as art? There is, of course, a saturation in the kinds of video games that we see out there. The scenario of video games nowadays, it's almost as if every time you went to the movies, all you could see was the Fast and Furious. Well, as it certainly is fun to watch submarines emerge from Arctic ice, we sometimes crave something deeper, something more meaningful. And these games aren't trying to push the medium, or rather embrace it, and really use it to its full extent to explore different things or to help in education. This is mostly because of the developers behind these games, the AAA developers, developers like Activision, EA, or Bethesda, who are generally putting out games and dumbing them down so they can be easier, they can be sold more easy, and they are also only selling and marketing games towards men, and women tend to not be so interested in those combat video games that I mentioned before. And so this also creates the divide in the demographic. Another big problem is with game journalists. Game journalists, unfortunately, tend to only review games as an entertainment package. How many hours of entertainment you can get for a certain price with certain graphics and certain gameplay features. But they fail to see how all those things combine to explore different themes and plot. But, of course, not everything is lost. There are some AAA developers who really embrace the medium, but most importantly, there are individual, that is, developers with less budget, or perhaps sometimes no budget at all, just doing it on their free time, who really embrace the medium and try to do something new. There are also game journalists who are trying to, who really analyze video games for their artistic capacity, such as the case with the very respectable lad in the banana costume over there, Harry Brewis, who publishes YouTube video essays. I recommend you check them out. His channel is Age Bomber Guy, where he talks about video games and how the techniques convey theme. Like, for example, he analyzes these games like you would in English class. And that's exactly what we're going to do for a bit, because games have value as art. They can also use different techniques to convey meaning. First, they are the culmination of different medium. You can see that there's visual arts in the concept art and in the graphic design. There is, of course, music in the development of soundtrack, even literature, writing the plot. But there is a whole other plethora of mechanics that can be used to convey meaning. A game that really tackles a hard subject is Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. It talks about mental illness, which is a thing that is very hard to tackle even in very established medium. First, it uses its bleak scenario to introduce the player to the desperation of mental illness. Secondly, it uses its genius sound design, its chaotic sound design, to introduce the character to the self-doubting of mental illness. This is achieved by simulating the audio hallucinations of someone suffering psychosis, which the main character suffers of. These come in the form of voices that tell the player where to go, but could also lead them in a trap, that encourage the player to succeed, but also taunt the player towards failure. This effectively makes the player doubt himself, as anyone with mental illness would. There is also the combat system, which underpowers the player, and it isn't a power fantasy like many other games are. Players can only damage one enemy at a time. The combat is very difficult, and in the end of the day, overcoming this combat and the story is a tale of the character overcoming her mental illness. This is a middle market game. It has a middle budget development, but it really embraces the medium and does something with that. But there are also AAA games that embrace the medium and try to make a statement, such as the case with one of my personal favorites, the Dishonored series. First, it talks about morality in an absurd world. It first establishes its own absurdity. The scenario is very bleak, as you can see. It is a world riddled with poverty, greed, corruption, but astronomically speaking, all the worlds in the Dishonored universe orbit around a black hole and are doomed to be destroyed soon. And so all the human suffering seems meaningless in this nihilistic context. But the game still encourages the player to embrace and actually have regard for human life instead of being another catalyst for suffering. There is a genius game mechanic called the heart, which is quite literally a heart, that the player can point a different character to reveal his most intimate secrets. Point it at a poor butcher and see that he only sowed plague-infected meats so he could feed his family for one more week. Point it at a corrupt guard and you see that he only accepted a bribe so he could buy medicine for his grandmother. But the game doesn't only allow the player to empathize with the world. The player can also act out this empathy. Because of the chaos system, which is fundamental to the outcome of the game, the player can play the entire game without killing a single character, really, without taking a single life. Ultimately, the game tries to make the point that even if our words are doomed, we must still cling to human life and morality and help each other. A reasonable polar opposite to this is Hotline Miami, which takes the Tarantino approach to criticizing violence, and that is immersing the player in hyper-violence. The combat system in this game is really quite engaging, and the soundtrack is blood-pumping and fuels the player through different murderous crusades. But at the end of the level, this game's genius sound design steps in. All the lights die down, the music is ended, and the player is forced to backtrack all the way to the place where he spawned in complete silence amongst the bodies of those he slayed. This effectively criticizes the way we're so enthralled with violence in our modern day, and a reality that is, sadly, as I aforementioned, sometimes even represented inside the very medium I'm talking about. But games do not need to talk about the deep universal conundrums of existence to be valid in the classroom. They can also teach us more pragmatic skills inside the classroom environment, such as the case with Kerbal Space Programs, which uses realistic physics simulations to simulate space, and then forces the player to send out different spaceships to explore it. This game requires a bit of an initial knowledge of astrophysics, but what is most important is that that knowledge can be expanded upon as the player plays. In other words, and as impossible as that might sound, people can have fun learning physics. This game's potential for teaching physics is so great that a student here at EAB, Jack Wiggins, is using it in his IA. There are also games that can teach about politics and history, such as the case with the Democracy Series, which is now in its third installment, that simulates a nation where the player is the president and has to draft out policy. He has to ban alcohol or allow it, control public infrastructure, and see how his policies resound with his electorate, which is a realistically simulated electorate of different nations. This is very good because it can teach learners why certain policies are so popular in some nations but not in others, why otherwise perfectly good policies are not implemented because of a loud and powerful majority of an electorate. It ultimately shows that a ruler's power in a democracy resounds from his electorate, or that is, the people. But there are games with a more cynical approach to politics. That is the case with Darkest Hour, which talks about politics in the context of the Second and the First World War. Players can not only brave these wars through military strategy, moving fleets, troops, etc., but they can also make alliances and break them as they see fit. They can also find ways to trade with other insurgent groups. This is a great simulation of what it is to be in a war scenario as a leader. And this game's potential to teach military history, military strategy, and as well as foreign policy is so great that the Marine Corps have to play this game in their training to, hone these skills. What I'm here to say is that it's not that we should drop George Orwell and start playing video games in English class. What I'm here to say is, though, that our youth are more and more enthralled with video games. 2-year-olds in restaurants are playing video games in their father's phones. 12-year-olds are defeating me in multiplayer games I sometimes play. Video games have a huge influence on our youth, and it is essential that we ensure that the games that we are playing are good games. Games that add something to our lives, games that not only entertain us, but teach us more about the human condition, or physics, or politics. It is essential that we start being more serious with our games. Well, as unserious as Harry Brewers is, I believe that he is one of the most respectable people out there in the game journalist community because he really understands that the medium is so powerful, it can convey themes so well, and it can otherwise teach in such an engaging manner that it needs to be taken seriously. We need to talk about video games like we talk about our art. We need to be worried if they are too saturated. We need to be certain that the right values are being represented inside of video games. And we need to talk about how video games can be art and education. I hope to see video games in school in the future, and I hope to have changed the minds of some people in regards to video games. Thank you.